The day I walked into that sterile conference room wearing my best thrift store blazer, I had no idea I was about to meet the man who would change my life forever. But I also had no idea that his family would spend the next 5 years trying to destroy me, convinced I was nothing more than a scheming gold digger who had trapped their precious son. What they didn't know was that while they were busy looking down on me, I was quietly building something that would make their family fortune look like pocket change. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Collins, and I want you to understand something from the very beginning. I never wanted their money. I never even knew how much money they had when I fell in love with their son. All I knew was that Ryan Mitchell had the kindest eyes I'd ever seen and a laugh that could light up the darkest room. But try explaining that to a family who measures everything in dollar signs and social status. I grew up in Cedar Valley, a neighborhood where your success was measured by whether you could keep the lights on and put food on the table every night. My father, Tom Collins, was a mechanic who came home every evening with grease under his fingernails and pride in his heart. My mother, Linda, taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school and spent her summers working at the community center because she believed every child deserved a chance to learn. We weren't poor, but we weren't rich either. We were solidly, unapologetically working class. Our house was a small 2-bedroom ranch with a front yard that my father meticulously maintained and a kitchen where my mother performed daily miracles, turning simple ingredients into meals that somehow always tasted like love. I shared a bedroom with my younger brother Danny until I was 16, when my parents converted the basement into a makeshift room so I could have some privacy while I studied for college entrance exams. Education was everything in our house, not because my parents had grand dreams of social climbing, but because they understood that knowledge was the one thing nobody could ever take away from you. Every report card was celebrated like a holiday. Every academic achievement, no matter how small, was met with the kind of enthusiasm most families reserved for winning the lottery. When I graduated as valedictorian of Cedar Valley High School, my parents threw a backyard barbecue that the whole neighborhood attended. Mrs. Patterson from next door brought her famous potato salad, and Mr. Johnson fired up his ancient grill to help my dad cook burgers for 40 people. That was my world. Small, humble, but filled with genuine affection and respect. Nobody cared what brand of clothes you wore or what kind of car you drove. What mattered was character, kindness, and how you treated the people around you. I worked 3 part-time jobs to pay my way through Riverside Community College. Mornings at the campus bookstore, afternoons tutoring struggling students in mathematics, and weekends cleaning office buildings downtown. It wasn't glamorous, but every paycheck brought me closer to my goal of transferring to Portland State University to study business administration. I had dreams of starting my own company someday, though I had no idea what kind of company it would be. I just knew I wanted to build something meaningful, something that would make my parents proud. It was during my 2nd year at Riverside that I met Ryan. I was rushing between classes, juggling my textbooks and a coffee cup that was way too full, when I literally ran into him outside the library. Coffee went everywhere, soaking both of us, and creating a small lake on the sidewalk. I was mortified, apologizing profusely while trying to salvage my soggy notes, when he started laughing. Not the kind of laugh that makes you feel stupid, but the kind that makes you want to laugh too. Ryan helped me gather my scattered papers, seemingly unbothered by the coffee stains on his obviously expensive shirt. He was tall with dark hair and those remarkable green eyes that seemed to see everything. While I frantically tried to clean up the mess, he calmly suggested we grab fresh coffee together so I could properly apologize. That first conversation lasted 3 hours. We talked about everything and nothing. He told me about his business classes, and I shared my dreams of entrepreneurship. He was easy to talk to, genuinely interested in what I had to say, and refreshingly down to earth. What I didn't know during those magical first few weeks of dating was that Ryan Mitchell was heir to Mitchell Industries, a manufacturing empire that had been built by his grandfather and expanded by his father into a multi-million-dollar conglomerate. Ryan never mentioned it, and frankly, I never asked. He drove a modest Honda Civic, dressed like any other college student, and seemed to work as hard as everyone else. If he had money, he certainly didn't flaunt it. Our relationship developed naturally over months of study sessions, coffee dates, and long walks around campus. Ryan was different from anyone I'd ever dated. He listened when I talked about my family, asking thoughtful questions about my father's work and my mother's teaching. He seemed genuinely fascinated by my world, often commenting that my family sounded warmer and more connected than anything he'd experienced growing up. The first hint that there might be more to Ryan's background came when he mentioned that his parents wanted to meet me. He seemed nervous about it, which I found endearing. I assumed he was just anxious about introducing his girlfriend to his family, the way any loving son might be. I spent weeks preparing, asking my mother for advice about what to wear and how to make a good first impression. I wanted them to like me because I was falling in love with their son, and family approval mattered to me. Ryan picked me up on a Saturday afternoon for the drive to Millbrook Heights. I'd put on my nicest dress, a navy blue one I'd bought for my high school graduation, and the only pair of dress shoes I owned. As we drove through increasingly upscale neighborhoods, I began to feel a knot forming in my stomach. The houses grew larger and more elaborate with each passing mile. Perfectly manicured lawns stretched behind ornate iron gates. European luxury cars sat in circular driveways like expensive jewelry displayed in shop windows. When Ryan finally turned into a gated community and approached a massive estate that looked like something from a magazine, I felt my breath catch in my throat. The Mitchell house wasn't just large, it was imposing. Stone pillars flanked a circular driveway that could have accommodated a dozen cars. Gardens that clearly required professional maintenance surrounded the building, and floor-to-ceiling windows gleamed like mirrors in the afternoon sun. Ryan must have noticed my shocked expression because he reached over and squeezed my hand. "I know it's a lot," he said quietly. "I should have prepared you better. I just wanted you to get to know me first, not for all this." He gestured toward the mansion with what looked like apologetic embarrassment. I appreciated his honesty, but I also felt completely unprepared. Not just for the wealth, but for the implications of that wealth. This wasn't just a nice family with a comfortable lifestyle. This was serious money, generational wealth, the kind of resources that put people in entirely different social stratospheres. Suddenly, Ryan's reluctance to discuss his family background made perfect sense. Patricia Mitchell answered the door herself, which surprised me. I'd half expected a butler or housekeeper. She was an elegant woman in her early 50s, perfectly coiffed and dressed in what I would later learn was a designer outfit that cost more than my father made in a month. Her smile was polite but cool as she looked me up and down, taking in every detail of my appearance with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to evaluating people at first glance. "You must be Emma," she said, extending a perfectly... Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story, manicured hand. "Please, come in." The interior of the house was even more impressive than the exterior. Marble floors reflected light from crystal chandeliers that hung from ceilings that seemed impossibly high. Original artwork adorned the walls, and every piece of furniture looked like it belonged in a museum. I felt like I was walking through a palace, acutely aware of my modest dress and department store shoes, clicking against floors that probably cost more than my parents' entire house. Robert Mitchell appeared from what I assumed was his study, and the resemblance between father and son was immediately apparent. Bob was an older, more distinguished version of Ryan, with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that comes from a lifetime of success and respect. His handshake was firm, his smile warm but evaluating. "So you're the young lady who's captured our son's attention," he said with the kind of jovial tone that somehow managed to sound both welcoming and slightly condescending. Dinner was served in a formal dining room that could have seated 20 people comfortably. I found myself sitting at a mahogany table that stretched for what seemed like miles, using silverware that felt substantial and foreign in my hands. The conversation started pleasantly enough, with polite questions about my studies and my family, but I could sense an undercurrent of evaluation, as if I were being interviewed for a position I hadn't applied for. Patricia asked about my parents' occupations, with the kind of careful politeness that people use when they already know they won't approve of the answer. When I mentioned that my father was a mechanic and my mother was an elementary school teacher, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Not contempt exactly, but a kind of satisfied confirmation of something she'd already suspected. "How lovely," she said in a tone that suggested it was anything but lovely. "Public service is so admirable, and mechanics are certainly essential. Where did you say you lived again?" "Cedar Valley," I replied, noticing how the name seemed to land in the elegant dining room like a foreign word that didn't quite belong. "Ah," Bob said, nodding as if that explained everything. "I know that area. Hard-working people, salt of the earth." The phrase salt of the earth stung more than I expected it to. It was one of those expressions that wealthy people used when they wanted to sound appreciative of working-class folks, while simultaneously emphasizing the vast distance between their worlds. Salt of the earth meant good people who knew their place and stayed in it. As the evening progressed, the questions became more pointed. Patricia wanted to know about my career plans, my family's financial situation, and my expectations for the future. Each inquiry felt like a gentle probe, designed to uncover my true motivations for dating their son. When I mentioned my dreams of starting my own business, Bob chuckled in a way that suggested he found the idea charmingly naive. "Entrepreneurship is challenging even for people with significant resources and connections," he said kindly but dismissively. "It might be wise to consider more stable career paths. Teaching, perhaps like your mother. Or office administration. There are many respectable jobs that provide steady income." The implication was clear. People like me didn't start businesses. People like me found safe, modest jobs and were grateful for them. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment and frustration, but I maintained my composure. Ryan shot his father a sharp look that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd disagreed about social and economic expectations. The real revelation came after dinner when Patricia invited me to join her for coffee in the sitting room while the men retreated to Bob's study. I thought this might be an opportunity for a more personal conversation, perhaps even a chance to connect with Ryan's mother on a woman-to-woman level. Instead, Patricia Mitchell delivered what can only be described as a warning disguised as friendly advice. "Emma, dear, you seem like a lovely girl," she began, settling into a chair that probably cost more than my family's car. "But I feel I should be honest with you about something. Ryan is going to inherit a great deal of responsibility someday. Mitchell Industries employs hundreds of people. There are charitable foundations, social obligations, and expectations that go far beyond what most people understand." I nodded, unsure where this conversation was heading, but certain I wasn't going to like the destination. "The woman Ryan eventually marries will need to be prepared for that kind of life," Patricia continued. "She'll need to understand how to navigate social circles, how to represent the family at important events, how to manage households and staff. These aren't skills that everyone possesses naturally." The message was becoming clearer, but I waited for her to spell it out completely. "I'm not saying this to hurt your feelings," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "But relationships that cross significant social boundaries rarely work out well for anyone involved. People are happiest when they're with others who share their background, their values, their understanding of the world." There it was, the polite, well-mannered way of telling me I wasn't good enough for her son. Not because I was a bad person, but because I came from the wrong world. Because my parents worked with their hands instead of managing stock portfolios. Because I'd never attended charity galas or summered in the Hamptons. "I appreciate your honesty," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "But I think you might be underestimating both Ryan and me. Love isn't about social boundaries. It's about finding someone who makes you want to be the best version of yourself." Patricia's smile became even more strained. "Of course, dear. Young love is always optimistic. But practical considerations have a way of becoming important as time goes on. Financial pressures, family expectations, lifestyle differences. These things matter more than people realize when they're caught up in romance." The implication was that I was either too naive to understand these realities or too calculating to care about them. Either way, I was being positioned as unsuitable for their son. When Ryan and I finally left that evening, I was quiet during the drive home. He kept glancing at me, clearly sensing that something had gone wrong, but not sure what it was. "They'll warm up to you," he said finally. "My mother can be protective, but she means well." I wanted to tell him about the conversation with his mother, about the not-so-subtle suggestion that I wasn't worthy of their family. But I also didn't want to put Ryan in the position of having to choose between me and his parents. At least, not yet. What I didn't realize was that this dinner was just the beginning. Patricia and Bob Mitchell had decided that I was a threat to their family's future, and they were prepared to do whatever it took to neutralize that threat. They would spend the next several months trying to drive a wedge between Ryan and me, using every tool at their disposal: social pressure, financial leverage, and ultimately, character assassination. But they made one crucial mistake in their assessment of me. They assumed that because I came from a working-class background, I must be either easily intimidated or primarily motivated by money. They couldn't conceive of a world where someone might love their son for reasons that had nothing to do with his inheritance. And they certainly never imagined that the quiet girl from Cedar Valley might have ambitions and capabilities that rivaled their own. Over the following weeks, Ryan began to change. Not dramatically, but in small ways that accumulated like tiny cuts. He started questioning decisions that he'd never questioned before. When I suggested inexpensive date ideas like hiking or cooking dinner together at my apartment, he would counter with expensive restaurants or events that I clearly couldn't afford. When I wore the same dress to multiple occasions, he began making comments about shopping and how he'd love to take me to boutiques his mother had recommended. At first, I thought he was just trying to share his world with me, but gradually I began to understand that these weren't innocent suggestions, they were tests. His parents had convinced him that if I truly cared about him, I would want to fit into their lifestyle. And if I was just interested in his money, I would eagerly accept expensive gifts and lavish experiences. It was a perfect trap. If I accepted their generosity, I would be confirming their suspicions that I was a gold digger. If I refused, I would seem ungrateful and unwilling to be part of their world. There was no correct response that would satisfy them. The pressure intensified when Patricia began arranging social events that I was expected to attend. Charity fundraisers, country club dinners, art gallery openings. Events where everyone knew everyone else, where conversations revolved around vacation homes and private schools and investment portfolios. I would stand next to Ryan, smiling politely while feeling completely out of place, acutely aware that every person in the room was evaluating me and finding me lacking. At one particularly memorable charity auction, Patricia made sure to introduce me to Victoria Ashworth, a young woman who clearly represented everything they hoped Ryan would want in a partner. Victoria was stunning in an effortless way that comes from a lifetime of professional stylists and personal trainers. She was well-educated, well-connected, and most importantly, well-bred. Her family had money that went back generations, and she moved through the elite social circles of Millbrook Heights like she'd been born to it. "Emma, this is Victoria," Patricia said with barely concealed satisfaction. "She and Ryan have known each other since childhood. Victoria just finished her MBA from Stanford, and she's starting a position at her family's investment firm." Victoria smiled at me with the kind of polished friendliness that wealthy people perfect in childhood. "How nice to meet you, Emma. Patricia tells me you're studying at Riverside Community College. That's wonderful. Education is so important, no matter where you get it." The subtle condescension in her tone was unmistakable. Victoria wasn't being deliberately cruel, but she also wasn't trying to hide her sense of superiority. To her, I was simply someone from a lower social stratum, who had somehow wandered into her territory. Ryan seemed oblivious to the undercurrents of these interactions, or perhaps he was choosing to ignore them. But I could see exactly what his parents were doing. They were surrounding him with reminders of what his life could be like with the right kind of woman, someone who understood their world, who could enhance rather than complicate their family's social standing. The final confrontation came on a cold evening in February, almost 6 months after that first dinner at the Mitchell estate. Ryan had been increasingly distant, canceling dates and seeming preoccupied when we were together. I could feel him pulling away, but I didn't understand why until Patricia Mitchell called me directly. "Emma, dear, I think it's time we had an honest conversation," she said in her perfectly modulated voice. "Could you meet me for coffee this afternoon, just the two of us?" I knew this wasn't really a request, it was a summons. Patricia had decided that subtle pressure wasn't working fast enough, and she was ready to take a more direct approach. We met at an upscale cafe in downtown Portland. the kind of place where a simple latte costs more than I usually spent on lunch. Patricia was already seated when I arrived, looking impeccable in a cream-colored cashmere coat that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "I'll get straight to the point," she said after ordering for both of us without asking what I wanted. "I know what you're doing, and I want it to stop." I blinked, genuinely confused. "I'm sorry, what do you think I'm doing?" "Playing the innocent act won't work with me," Patricia said coolly. "You saw an opportunity with a wealthy, naive young man, and you took it. I understand the appeal. Ryan is handsome, kind, and he's going to inherit a substantial fortune. But you're wasting his time and yours." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Not because it was true, but because it was so fundamentally wrong and yet delivered with such conviction. "Mrs. Mitchell, I think you've misunderstood my relationship with Ryan," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I love your son. Not his money, not his inheritance, but him. I loved him before I even knew your family had money." Patricia laughed, a sound like ice cubes clinking in an expensive glass. "Oh, please, don't insult my intelligence. A girl from your background doesn't meet a boy from ours by accident. You knew exactly who he was when you targeted him." "Targeted him?" The word came out louder than I intended, causing other cafe patrons to glance in our direction. "I literally ran into him by accident outside the library. I spilled coffee all over both of us. How exactly does that constitute targeting?" "Details can be manufactured," Patricia said dismissively. "What matters is the pattern. You've been systematically positioning yourself as the perfect girlfriend. Sweet, hardworking, grateful for any attention. It's very calculated." I felt something inside me break. Not my heart, exactly, but my faith in the possibility that these people could ever see me as anything other than a threat to be eliminated. "You know what, Mrs. Mitchell? You're right about one thing. I am hardworking. I work 3 jobs to pay for school because my family can't afford to hand me everything I want. I study until 2 in the morning because I believe education matters. And yes, I'm grateful for attention from someone who treats me with respect and kindness. But those aren't strategies or calculations. They're just who I am." Patricia leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. "And who you are isn't suitable for my son. Ryan needs someone who can match his social position. Someone who understands the responsibilities that come with wealth. Someone who can be an asset to his future rather than a liability." "Someone like Victoria Ashworth?" I asked. "Exactly like Victoria Ashworth," Patricia confirmed without hesitation. "Victoria understands our world. She has the breeding, the education, the connections that Ryan needs in a wife. She can help him expand the business, navigate social obligations, raise children who will be prepared for their inheritance." The word breeding hung in the air between us like a slap. I'd been reduced to livestock, evaluated for my genetic and social pedigree rather than my character or capabilities. "I'm going to make you an offer," Patricia continued, reaching into her designer handbag and pulling out an envelope. "There's a check in here for $50,000. More money than you've probably ever seen in one place. Take it, end things with Ryan, and disappear from our lives. Use it to finish your education somewhere far from here. Find someone from your own social level and build a nice, simple life." I stared at the envelope, feeling like I was watching this conversation happen to someone else. The amount of money was staggering, more than my parents made in 2 years combined. But the offer itself was so insulting, so fundamentally wrong in its assumptions about my motivations, that I almost laughed. "You really think this is about money?" I said slowly. "You honestly believe that I'm dating your son because I want access to your family's wealth?" "Of course it's about money," Patricia said impatiently. "What else could it possibly be about? You have nothing to offer Ryan except youth and physical attraction, and those fade. But if you take this money and leave now, you can start fresh somewhere else. No one gets hurt." I stood up from the table, leaving the envelope untouched. "Mrs. Mitchell, I wouldn't take your money if I was starving. And I'm not going to end my relationship with Ryan, because you've decided I'm not good enough for him. If Ryan wants to break up with me, he can do it himself." Patricia's composure cracked slightly, revealing the steel underneath her polished exterior. "You're making a mistake, Emma. If you won't take the easy way out, I'll find other ways to make sure you understand that you don't belong in our family." The threat was clear, even though the specifics remained vague. Patricia Mitchell was declaring war, and she was confident she had all the weapons she needed to win. I left that cafe feeling like I'd just survived a hurricane. The woman I'd tried so hard to impress, the mother of the man I loved, had just offered me money to disappear from her son's life. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because my parents weren't wealthy enough to make me an acceptable daughter-in-law. That night, I called my mother and told her everything. About the Mitchell family's wealth, about Patricia's accusations and her offer, about the growing pressure to be someone I wasn't. My mother listened without interrupting, the way she'd always done when I needed to process something difficult. "Honey," she said when I finished, "there's something your father and I have always tried to teach you. Your worth as a person has nothing to do with how much money you have or where you come from. It has everything to do with how you treat people and how you live your values. If this boy's family can't see that, then maybe they're not the kind of people you want to be connected to anyway." But I wasn't ready to give up on Ryan. Despite everything his parents had said and done, I still believed that our relationship could survive their disapproval. I still believed that love was stronger than social expectations and family pressure. I was wrong about a lot of things in those days, but I was absolutely right about one thing. I wasn't going anywhere. And Patricia Mitchell had just made the biggest mistake of her privileged life by underestimating exactly what kind of person she was dealing with. The war between me and the Mitchell family was just beginning, and they had no idea what they'd started. I walked into my apartment that night feeling like I'd been through battle. The conversation with Patricia Mitchell kept replaying in my mind, each word more insulting than the last. But underneath the hurt and anger, something else was growing. A fierce determination that I hadn't felt since the day I decided to go to college, despite my family's financial struggles. Patricia Mitchell thought she could buy me off with $50,000 and a speech about knowing my place. She was about to learn that Emma Collins didn't back down from anything, especially not when someone attacked the people she loved. The next morning, I called Ryan and asked him to meet me for lunch at our usual spot, a small diner near campus where we'd had some of our best conversations. I needed to tell him about his mother's offer, but I also needed to see where he stood. Did he know what his family was doing? Was he part of their plan to get rid of me? Ryan arrived looking unusually tense, and my heart sank. Maybe Patricia had already gotten to him, planted seeds of doubt about my motivations. But when he saw me, his face relaxed into the familiar smile that had first made me fall in love with him. "Emma, I'm so glad you called," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. "I've been thinking about us, about everything that's been happening with my family." Here it comes, I thought. The breakup speech. The explanation about how we're from different worlds, and it's just too complicated to make this work. Instead, Ryan reached across the table and took my hand. "I want to apologize for my parents' behavior. I know they've been putting pressure on you, making you feel unwelcome. That's not fair, and it's not who I want to be." I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost brought tears to my eyes. "Ryan, there's something I need to tell you about yesterday." I took a deep breath and told him everything about my meeting with his mother. The accusations, the offer, the threats. I watched his face change from confusion to disbelief to anger. "She offered you money to leave me?" His voice was quiet, but I could hear the fury underneath. "My mother actually tried to pay you to break up with me?" $50,000, I confirmed. She seemed to think that was more money than I had ever seen, and that I'd jump at the chance to take it. Ryan ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd learned meant he was really upset. "Emma, I am so sorry. I had no idea she would go that far. I knew she had reservations about us, but this is completely unacceptable." "What are you going to do?" I asked, genuinely curious. This was the moment that would define our relationship. Would Ryan stand up to his family for me, or would he find a way to smooth things over while asking me to be more understanding? "I'm going to have a conversation with both my parents," he said firmly. "This stops now. Either they accept that you're the woman I've chosen to be with, or they can deal with the consequences of losing their son." Those words sent a thrill through me. Not because I wanted Ryan to fight with his family, but because he was choosing us over their approval. He was willing to risk his relationship with his parents to protect our relationship. That weekend, Ryan drove to Millbrook Heights alone. He'd asked me to stay home, saying this was a conversation he needed to have with his family without me there. I spent those hours alternating between hope and dread, wondering if this would be the beginning of a new chapter for us or the end of everything we'd built together. When Ryan returned that evening, he looked exhausted but determined. "Well, I've officially been disowned," he said with a bitter laugh. "Apparently, choosing my own girlfriend over their social expectations makes me an ungrateful disappointment to the family legacy." "Ryan, I'm so sorry," I said, even though part of me was secretly relieved that he'd chosen me. "What exactly did they say?" "My father gave me an ultimatum. Stop seeing you or lose my position at Mitchell Industries." My mother was even more direct. She said that if I marry you, I can forget about my inheritance and any future support from the family. Ryan shook his head in disgust. "They're so convinced you're using me for money that they can't comprehend any other explanation for our relationship." The irony was stunning. In trying to protect their son from a gold digger, they'd removed all the gold from the equation. If Ryan stayed with me now, it would prove once and for all that money had nothing to do with our relationship. "So what happens now?" I asked. "Now we build our own life," Ryan said, pulling me into his arms. "I have my degree, my skills, and my savings. We don't need their money or their approval, we just need each other." For the next 6 months, we lived in a bubble of defiant happiness. Ryan moved out of the guest house on his parents' property and into a modest apartment downtown. He found a job at a small consulting firm that paid a fraction of what he would have made at Mitchell Industries, but he seemed genuinely happy to be earning his own way. We went on hiking dates, cooked dinner together in his tiny kitchen, and spent weekends exploring Portland like tourists in our own city. This was the Ryan I'd fallen in love with at community college. Without the pressure of family expectations and social obligations, he was relaxed, funny, and completely present in our relationship. He never mentioned missing the luxury or the status that came with being a Mitchell heir. If anything, he seemed relieved to be free of those burdens. We started making plans for our future. Ryan wanted to eventually start his own consulting business, and I was getting closer to finishing my degree. We talked about getting married after I graduated, maybe buying a small house in one of Portland's up-and-coming neighborhoods. Nothing fancy, but something that would be truly ours. I should have realized that his parents wouldn't give up so easily. The Mitchells didn't build a business empire by accepting defeat when their first strategy failed. They simply regrouped and developed a more sophisticated approach. The attack came from an unexpected direction. One morning, I arrived at the campus bookstore for my opening shift to find my manager, Mrs. Chen, waiting for me with an uncomfortable expression. "Emma, I need to speak with you privately," she said, leading me to the small office behind the cash register. "I received a very disturbing phone call yesterday from someone claiming to be a family member of yours." My stomach dropped. "What kind of phone call?" "A woman said she was your aunt and that she felt obligated to warn us about some problems you've been having. She said you'd been caught stealing from previous employers and that your family was concerned about your influence on other students." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "Mrs. Chen, I don't have an aunt, and I've never stolen anything in my life. Someone is lying to you." Mrs. Chen looked relieved. "I hoped that was the case. You've been one of our most reliable employees, and these accusations didn't match anything I'd observed about your character. But I have to ask, do you have any idea who might want to damage your reputation?" The answer was obvious, but I couldn't prove it. Patricia Mitchell had found a new way to attack me, one that was much more subtle than offering me money to disappear. She was trying to destroy my life piece by piece, making it impossible for me to work or succeed academically. Over the next few weeks, similar phone calls were made to my other employers and even to some of my professors. Always from anonymous family members or concerned friends, sharing vague but damaging accusations about my character. Nothing specific enough to be easily disproven, but serious enough to plant seeds of doubt. I lost my tutoring job when parents started asking questions about my background. The office cleaning company let me go after receiving complaints about my reliability, despite the fact that I'd never missed a shift or received a single complaint from any of the buildings I cleaned. Ryan was furious when I told him what was happening. "This has to be my mother," he said, pacing around his apartment like a caged animal. "She's the only one with the resources and connections to orchestrate something like this." "Can you prove it?" I asked. "Not in a way that would hold up in court," he admitted. "But I know how she operates. This is exactly the kind of campaign she'd run to drive someone out of town without getting her hands dirty." The pressure was working. Without my jobs, I was struggling to pay for school and basic living expenses. I'd always been proud of my financial independence, but now I was forced to accept help from Ryan, which made me feel like I was proving his parents right about my motivations. Even worse, the stress was affecting my academic performance. I found myself distracted during classes, constantly worried about what new accusation might surface next. My grades, which had always been my source of pride and security, began to slip. Ryan suggested that I move in with him to save money on rent, and, reluctantly, I agreed. It was a practical decision, but it also felt like a surrender. I was letting the Mitchells force me into exactly the kind of dependent relationship they'd accused me of wanting in the first place. The apartment felt different once I moved in. Smaller, more cramped, charged with the tension of two people trying to navigate a crisis that was bigger than both of us. Ryan was dealing with his own struggles, having been effectively blacklisted from the better consulting firms in Portland. It seemed that Mitchell Industries had significant influence in the local business community, and word had somehow gotten out that Ryan was persona non grata with his family. One evening in late summer, as we sat in our tiny living room trying to stretch a dinner of pasta and canned sauce, Ryan's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and his expression changed. "It's Victoria," he said, showing me the caller ID. "Victoria Ashworth?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Ryan nodded, staring at the phone as it continued to ring. "I haven't talked to her since before we started dating. I can't imagine why she'd be calling now." "Answer it," I said, though every instinct told me this call was going to change everything. Ryan put the phone on speaker, and Victoria's cultured voice filled our small apartment. "Ryan, darling, I hope you don't mind me calling out of the blue. I've been thinking about you so much lately." "Hi, Victoria," Ryan said carefully. "It's good to hear from you. What's going on?" "Well, I heard through the grapevine that you've been having some challenges lately. Professional difficulties, family tensions. I wanted you to know that there might be some opportunities available if you're interested in exploring them." I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't a casual call from an old friend. This was a recruitment pitch. "What kind of opportunities?" Ryan asked. "My family's investment firm is expanding, and we're looking for someone with your background and skills. The position would involve significant travel, excellent compensation, and the chance to work with some very prestigious clients. It would be a fresh start, a chance to rebuild your career on your own terms." "That sounds interesting," Ryan said slowly. "What would be the timeline for something like that?" "We'd want someone to start as soon as possible. Next month, ideally. The position is based in New York initially, with potential for international assignments. It's exactly the kind of opportunity that someone with your talents deserves." New York. International assignments. Everything that would take Ryan as far away from Portland, and from me as possible. I could see the calculation behind Victoria's offer, and it was brilliant in its simplicity. She wasn't asking Ryan to choose between me and his career. She was offering him a way to have the career he wanted while making it geographically impossible to maintain our relationship. After Ryan hung up, we sat in silence for a long time. I could see him thinking, weighing his options, calculating the costs and benefits of staying versus leaving. "It's a good opportunity," I said finally, because someone had to acknowledge the elephant in the room. "It is," he agreed. "It would solve a lot of problems. Financial pressure, career stagnation, the whole mess with my family." "All of your problems except one," I said quietly. "What's that?" "Me. I'm the one problem that would be solved by you taking that job." Ryan turned to look at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Not doubt about his feelings for me, but doubt about whether those feelings were worth the price he was paying to maintain them. "Emma, that's not fair," he said. "You know I love you. But we have to be realistic about our situation. My family has more resources and influence than we ever imagined. They can make our lives miserable indefinitely." "So we let them win?" I asked. "We make a strategic retreat," he said. "I take the job, establish myself professionally, and then we figure out how to be together without all this external pressure." I wanted to believe that could work, but I could hear the doubt in his own voice. Once Ryan left for New York, once he was back in the world of prestigious careers and social connections, would he still want the community college girl from Cedar Valley? Or would he meet someone like Victoria, someone who could share his new life without complicating it? "How long would you be gone?" I asked. "The initial contract is for 2 years," he said. "But depending on how things go, it could be longer." 2 years felt like a lifetime. 2 years of long-distance phone calls and occasional visits. 2 years of me finishing school and starting my career while wondering if the man I loved was falling in love with someone else 3,000 miles away. But what choice did we have? Ryan's parents had systematically destroyed his opportunities in Portland, and they'd done their best to destroy mine as well. Maybe separating temporarily was the only way to survive their assault on our relationship. "If this is what you need to do, I understand," I said, though the words felt like swallowing glass. Ryan pulled me into his arms, and I could feel the relief in his body. The decision was made, even if neither of us wanted to admit it out loud. "It's not forever," he said into my hair. "Once I'm established, once I have some independence from my family's influence, we can figure out how to make this work." I nodded against his chest, but I was already mourning the loss of what we'd had. The easy intimacy, the shared dreams, the feeling that we were building something together. All of that was about to disappear, replaced by the uncertainty of a long-distance relationship that would be tested by time, distance, and the constant pressure of other opportunities. Ryan left for New York 6 weeks later. We spent his last night in Portland, making promises about staying in touch, about visits and phone calls, and maintaining our connection across the miles. We both pretended to believe that nothing fundamental was changing, that this was just a temporary adjustment to our plans. I drove him to the airport the next morning, and we stood at the security checkpoint trying to find words for a goodbye that felt more final than either of us wanted to admit. "I love you," Ryan said, holding my face in his hands. "That's not going to change." "I love you too," I replied, memorizing the feeling of his touch. I watched him disappear through security, and then I drove home to an empty apartment that still smelled like his cologne. For the first time since Patricia Mitchell had offered me money to disappear from her son's life, I wondered if maybe she'd been right about one thing. Maybe love wasn't enough to overcome the practical realities of coming from different worlds. But I wasn't ready to give up yet. I still had my education to finish, my dreams to pursue, and my own future to build. If Ryan and I were meant to be together, we'd find a way to make it work. And if we weren't, at least I'd have something to show for all the pain and struggle of the past year. What I didn't know was that while I was mourning the temporary end of my relationship with Ryan, something much more important was beginning. The seeds of my own success were already planted, and Patricia Mitchell's attempts to destroy me had actually forced me to become stronger, more resourceful, and more determined than I'd ever been before. The war between me and the Mitchell family was far from over. But the battlefield was about to shift in ways that none of us could have predicted, and when the dust settled, it would be very clear who had underestimated whom. The weeks after Ryan left blurred together in a haze of loneliness and financial anxiety. Our apartment felt cavernous without him, every corner echoing with memories of conversations we'd never have again, meals we'd never share, dreams we'd probably never fulfill together. I found myself sleeping on the couch because the bedroom held too many reminders of what I'd lost. Ryan called every night for the first week, his voice crackling through poor phone connections as he described his new life in Manhattan. The job was everything Victoria had promised: prestigious clients, challenging projects, and a salary that dwarfed anything he could have earned in Portland. He was staying in a corporate apartment in Midtown until he found his own place, and from his descriptions, even the temporary housing was more luxurious than anywhere we'd ever lived together. The work is intense, he told me during one of our late-night calls. 12-hour days are normal, and I'm traveling to client sites constantly. But Emma, the opportunities here are incredible. I'm working on deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I tried to sound supportive and enthusiastic, but each conversation felt like watching him drift further away from the life we'd planned together. He was speaking a language I didn't understand, referencing people I'd never meet, describing experiences I couldn't share. The boy who'd been content cooking pasta in our tiny kitchen was disappearing, replaced by someone who belonged in boardrooms and exclusive restaurants. By the second week, our calls became shorter and less frequent. Ryan was always rushing to a meeting or catching a flight, and the time difference made coordination increasingly difficult. I'd call during my lunch break only to reach his voicemail. He'd call me back hours later when I was already asleep. The physical distance was manageable, but the emotional distance was devastating. We were becoming strangers to each other, connected only by increasingly strained conversations about our incompatible daily lives. Meanwhile, my own situation was deteriorating rapidly. Despite searching constantly, I couldn't find new employment. Word had somehow spread throughout Portland's service industry that I was unreliable, dishonest, or difficult to work with. The anonymous phone campaigns had been devastatingly effective. Potential employers would seem interested until they called references or did background checks, and then they'd suddenly decide I wasn't the right fit. I was forced to dip into my small savings account, watching my financial security evaporate with each passing day. Rent, groceries, textbooks, gas for my aging car, expenses that had once been manageable with 3 part-time jobs became overwhelming when I had no income at all. The stress was affecting every aspect of my life. My remaining courses suffered as I spent more time job hunting than studying. I'd always been the student who sat in the front row, asked thoughtful questions, and turned in assignments early. Now I found myself scrambling to complete basic requirements, my work suffering from exhaustion and distraction. Dr. Martinez, my business administration professor, asked me to stay after class one afternoon. She was a woman in her 50s who'd built her own consulting company before transitioning to academia, and she'd always been encouraging about my entrepreneurial aspirations. "Emma, I've noticed a significant change in your academic performance this semester," she said gently. "Your early work was exceptional, but your recent assignments have been rushed and unfocused. Is everything all right?" I wanted to tell her everything. About Ryan's family, about the systematic campaign to destroy my reputation, about watching my dreams crumble while feeling powerless to stop it. But how could I explain without sounding paranoid or self-pitying? "I've been dealing with some personal challenges," I said carefully. "Financial stress, employment difficulties. I'm working through it." Dr. Martinez nodded sympathetically. "Would it help to discuss some options? There are emergency financial aid programs, work-study opportunities, academic counseling services. Sometimes taking a semester off to stabilize your situation can be the best long-term strategy." The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. Taking time off from school felt like giving up, like admitting that Patricia Mitchell had won. My education was the one thing I'd fought for, sacrificed for, built my entire identity around. If I lost that, what would be left? "I appreciate the offer," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "But I'm going to finish what I started." Dr. Martinez looked like she wanted to say more, but she simply nodded. "My office door is always open if you change your mind." That evening, I called my parents for the first time in weeks. I'd been avoiding contact because I didn't want to worry them, and I was embarrassed about how dramatically my life had deteriorated. But I needed to hear familiar voices, to remember who I was before the Mitchell family had tried to redefine me. My mother answered on the second ring, and the warmth in her voice almost made me cry. "Emma, sweetheart, we've been wondering how you were doing. How's school? How's Ryan?" "Ryan got a job in New York," I said, which was true if incomplete. "He's doing really well." "That's wonderful, honey. Long-distance relationships are challenging, but if you're meant to be together, you'll find a way to make it work. What about you? How are your classes going?" I told her about my academic struggles, though I downplayed the extent of the problems. I mentioned my employment difficulties, framing them as temporary setbacks rather than the systematic destruction they actually were. My parents had enough worries without adding my problems to their burden. You know what your father always says, my mother reminded me. When life knocks you down, you get back up swinging. You're stronger than whatever challenges you're facing, Emma. I've seen you overcome obstacles before. After we hung up, I sat in my empty apartment thinking about resilience and determination. My parents had raised me to believe that hard work and persistence could overcome any obstacle. But what happened when the obstacles weren't natural challenges but deliberate sabotage by people with unlimited resources and no moral constraints? I was about to find out exactly how far the Mitchell family was willing to go to erase me from their son's life. The next blow came from an unexpected direction. I received a call from the registrar's office asking me to come in immediately to discuss my academic standing. When I arrived at the administrative building, I was directed to a sterile conference room where 3 officials were waiting with serious expressions and a thick file folder. Miss Collins, we've received some very concerning information about your academic integrity, the Dean of Students began. We've been contacted by someone who claims to have evidence that you've been submitting plagiarized work and falsifying academic records. The room felt like it was spinning. That's completely untrue. I've never plagiarized anything in my life. Every assignment I've turned in has been my original work. We hope that's the case, the registrar said diplomatically. But we're required to investigate all allegations of academic dishonesty thoroughly. Until this matter is resolved, you'll be suspended from classes and unable to access university resources. Who made these accusations? I demanded. The complaint was filed anonymously, the dean replied. However, the person provided detailed information about specific assignments and alleged irregularities in your academic history. I felt like I was drowning. After destroying my employment prospects, the Mitchells had moved on to attacking my education directly. They were systematically dismantling every foundation of my independent life. How long will this investigation take? I asked. These processes can be quite lengthy, the academic affairs officer said. Several weeks at minimum, possibly longer depending on the complexity of the allegations and the availability of evidence. Several weeks. In my financial situation, several weeks without the ability to complete courses or access student resources might as well have been several years. I was being pushed toward the cliff edge of complete failure. I left that meeting feeling more defeated than I'd ever felt in my life. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd sacrificed for, was being systematically destroyed by people who viewed me as nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle to their family planning. That night, I called Ryan to tell him what was happening. For the first time since he'd left, I let my composure crack completely. They're destroying my life, I said through tears. Your mother isn't just trying to separate us anymore. She's trying to make sure I have nothing left. No job, no education, no future. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Ryan finally spoke, his voice sounded strained and distant. Emma, I know this is difficult, but maybe we need to consider the possibility that fighting my family isn't sustainable. They have resources we can't match, and they're clearly willing to use them. So I should just give up? Let them win? Maybe you should think about starting fresh somewhere else, he said quietly. There are good schools in other states, other cities, where my family's influence doesn't reach. You could transfer your credits, finish your degree, build a life that doesn't involve this constant warfare. The suggestion felt like a betrayal. Ryan was asking me to run away, to abandon everything I'd built in Portland because his family had made my life there impossible. He was asking me to disappear from his world just as surely as if I'd taken his mother's money. What about us? I asked. Another long pause. I don't know, Emma. This situation is bigger than what either of us can handle. Maybe we need to accept that love isn't always enough to overcome practical realities. Those words shattered something inside me that I hadn't even realized was still intact. After everything we'd been through, after all the promises and plans and dreams we'd shared, Ryan was giving up on us. Not because he'd stopped loving me, but because fighting for that love had become too inconvenient, too expensive, too complicated for the life he wanted to build. I see, I said, my voice suddenly calm. So when things get difficult, when your family applies pressure, the solution is for me to disappear. How is that different from what your mother wanted all along? That's not fair, Ryan said defensively. I'm trying to find a solution that works for both of us. No, You're trying to find a solution that works for you, one where you get to keep your family's approval and your prestigious career, while I get to start over from nothing in some city where I don't know anyone. Emma, please try to understand. I understand perfectly, I interrupted. Your mother was right about one thing. When it comes down to choosing between your old life and your new one, between your family's expectations and our relationship, the choice is obvious. I hung up before he could respond, and for the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The illusion that Ryan and I were partners fighting the world together had finally been shattered. I was on my own, exactly where Patricia Mitchell had always intended me to be. But instead of feeling defeated, I felt something else stirring inside me. Anger. Pure, focused fury at the people who thought they could manipulate and control others simply because they had money and social connections. They'd pushed me to the breaking point, assuming I would crumble under pressure like so many others probably had before me. They were about to learn that Emma Collins from Cedar Valley wasn't so easily broken. The academic investigation dragged on for 6 weeks, during which I was essentially trapped in a bureaucratic limbo. I couldn't attend classes, couldn't access the library, couldn't even set foot on campus without special permission. The officials assigned to my case seemed to be in no hurry to resolve the matter, despite the obvious lack of evidence supporting the allegations. I spent those weeks in my apartment, burning through the last of my savings while trying to figure out what to do next. Ryan called a few more times, but our conversations were stilted and uncomfortable. He was clearly struggling with guilt about our breakup, but not enough to actually fight for our relationship or challenge his family's behavior. The final betrayal came on a Thursday evening in late October. I was mindlessly scrolling through social media, something I'd been doing too much of since my enforced isolation began, when I saw a photo that stopped my heart. It was posted on Victoria Ashworth's Instagram account, a picture of her and Ryan at what looked like an upscale charity gala in Manhattan. They were standing close together, Victoria radiant in a designer gown, Ryan handsome in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. But what killed me wasn't the obvious intimacy between them, or even the way Ryan was looking at Victoria like she was the most fascinating woman in the room. It was the caption beneath the photo: "Wonderful evening supporting childhood literacy with this amazing man. Some things are just meant to be. Some things are just meant to be." The phrase echoed in my mind like a death knell. This wasn't just Ryan moving on with someone new. This was Ryan embracing exactly the life his parents had always wanted for him, with exactly the woman they'd always hoped he'd choose. I scrolled through more of Victoria's recent posts and found a trail of evidence that made the timeline clear. Ryan hadn't been gradually falling out of love with me due to distance and circumstance. He'd been falling in love with Victoria almost from the moment he'd arrived in New York. The job she'd offered him hadn't just been a career opportunity. It had been an elaborate courtship, a way to remove him from my influence and demonstrate what his life could be like with the right kind of woman. The worst part was how happy he looked in every photo, not conflicted or guilty or mourning the loss of our relationship. Just genuinely, radiantly happy, in a way I'd rarely seen during our time together. Maybe he'd never been as content with our modest life as I'd believed. Maybe the pressure from his family had been an excuse to escape a relationship he'd outgrown. I stared at my phone screen until my eyes burned, studying every detail of those photos like they might reveal some hidden truth that would make this hurt less. But there was no hidden truth. Ryan Mitchell had chosen his world over mine, his family's approval over our love, and his future with Victoria over any future with me. I was completely and utterly alone. The next morning I woke up with a strange sense of peace. Not happiness or relief, but the calm that comes after a storm has finally passed, and you can assess the damage honestly. My relationship with Ryan was over. My academic career was in ruins. My financial situation was desperate. My reputation in Portland had been systematically destroyed by people who viewed me as nothing more than an inconvenient problem to be solved. But I was still here. Still breathing, still thinking, still capable of making choices about what happened next. Patricia Mitchell had tried to erase me from her son's life, and she'd succeeded. But she'd made one crucial mistake in her calculations. She'd assumed that destroying my connection to Ryan would destroy me entirely. That without access to the Mitchell family's wealth and status, I would simply fade away into the background of working-class obscurity where people like me belonged. What she didn't understand was that I'd never needed Ryan's money or his family's approval to know my own worth. I'd built my identity around my intelligence, my work ethic, and my determination long before I'd ever met their precious son. Those qualities hadn't disappeared when our relationship ended. If anything, the crucible of the past few months had made them stronger. I spent that day walking around Portland, really seeing the city for the first time in months. Not as the place where I'd fallen in love or built dreams with someone else, but as the place where I was going to rebuild my life entirely on my own terms. I thought about my options realistically. I could follow Ryan's suggestion and transfer to a school in another state, starting over where the Mitchell family's influence couldn't reach me. That would be the safe choice, the practical choice, the choice that would allow me to escape this battle with my dignity relatively intact. Or I could stay and fight. Not for Ryan, not for our relationship, but for my own right to exist in this city without being driven away by people who thought their money made them more important than everyone else. The choice was easier than I'd expected. Emma Collins didn't run from fights, especially when she was clearly in the right. The Mitchell family had declared war on me, assuming I was too weak or too poor or too intimidated to fight back effectively. They were about to discover just how wrong they'd been about all of those assumptions. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in weeks. I opened my laptop and started researching. Not job opportunities or transfer schools, but business law, intellectual property rights, and the public records associated with Mitchell Industries. If the Mitchells wanted to play hardball, I was going to learn the rules of their game better than they knew them themselves. I also did something else that felt significant. I deleted Ryan's phone number from my contacts, unfollowed him on social media, and removed every photo of us from my apartment. Not out of anger, but out of acceptance. That chapter of my life was over, and it was time to start writing a new one. The girl who'd fallen in love with the boy in a college library was gone. In her place was a woman who'd been tested by fire and emerged harder, smarter, and more determined than ever before. Patricia Mitchell thought she'd won by separating me from her son. She had no idea that she'd actually done me the biggest favor of my life. The morning I decided to fight back rather than run away, I woke up before dawn with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I made coffee in my tiny kitchen and sat at the card table that served as my dining room, laptop open, surrounded by printouts and notebooks filled with research. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had a plan. My first step was to clear my name at the university. I'd spent weeks passively waiting for the academic integrity investigation to resolve itself, but passive waiting was a luxury I could no longer afford. I needed to take control of the narrative. I requested a formal hearing with the Academic Review Board, which was my right as an accused student. More importantly, I hired a lawyer. Not an expensive one, obviously, but a recent graduate from Portland State's law school who specialized in academic rights and civil liberties. Sarah Kim had built her practice defending students against administrative overreach, and she took my case on a payment plan I could barely afford. "The allegations against you are suspiciously vague," Sarah told me during our first meeting. "Academic dishonesty charges usually include specific evidence. Plagiarized passages, forged documents, falsified data. What you're facing sounds more like a fishing expedition than a legitimate investigation." "Can we prove that?" I asked. "We can raise enough procedural questions to force them to produce actual evidence or drop the charges," she said. "The anonymous nature of the complaint is particularly problematic. Academic institutions have due process requirements, and those include the right to face your accusers." The hearing was scheduled for the following week. I spent those days preparing with Sarah, reviewing every assignment I'd ever submitted, documenting my research process, and gathering character references from professors who'd worked with me before this mess started. Dr. Martinez proved to be an invaluable ally. When I explained the situation to her, she immediately agreed to testify on my behalf. "Emma, I've been teaching for 15 years, she told me. "I can spot plagiarized work from across the room, and I can tell when someone is trying to game the system. Your work has always been original, thoughtful, and well-researched. This investigation is either a mistake or a deliberate attack on your character." The hearing itself was held in a conference room that felt more like a courtroom. 5 faculty members sat behind a long table, reviewing files and looking appropriately serious. Sarah and I sat across from them, with a court reporter documenting every word. The university's representative, a nervous administrative assistant named Mr. Peterson, presented the case against me. As Sarah had predicted, the evidence was laughably thin. Anonymous allegations about suspicious similarities in my work, vague claims about irregularities in my academic record, and absolutely no specific examples of actual wrongdoing. When it was our turn to respond, Sarah methodically dismantled every allegation. She presented my original research notes, my documented sources, and testimony from professors who could vouch for the authenticity of my work. More importantly, she raised serious questions about the university's handling of the case. The anonymous nature of these complaints violates established due process standards, she argued. My client has the right to know who is accusing her and to examine the evidence being used against her. What we have here isn't evidence of academic dishonesty. It's evidence of a campaign of harassment designed to force Ms. Collins out of this institution. The hearing lasted 3 hours. When it was over, the review board retired to deliberate, and Sarah and I waited in the hallway like defendants in a criminal trial. "How do you think it went?" I asked. "I think they realize they've been played," Sarah said. "The question is whether they're willing to admit it publicly." The board recalled us 2 hours later. The chairwoman, Dr. Foster, looked distinctly uncomfortable as she read their decision. After careful review of all evidence and testimony, this board finds no substantive proof of academic dishonesty on the part of Ms. Collins. All charges are hereby dismissed, and Ms. Collins is immediately reinstated with full privileges. I felt like I could breathe for the first time in weeks. But Dr. Foster wasn't finished. However, this board is deeply concerned about the nature of the allegations made against Ms. Collins and the potential that these complaints may have been filed in bad faith. We are referring this matter to the university's legal department for possible action against whoever filed these false accusations. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. I was officially cleared, back in school, and the university was actually investigating the people who'd tried to destroy me. For the first time since this battle began, I felt like I was winning, instead of just surviving. But being cleared by the university didn't solve my fundamental problems. I still had no income, depleted savings, and a reputation in Portland that had been systematically destroyed. I needed work, but I also needed to be strategic about how I rebuilt my professional life. That's when I remembered something Dr. Martinez had mentioned during our conversation about my academic struggles. She'd offered to connect me with some of her former consulting clients who might need temporary help with project-based work. At the time, I'd been too focused on traditional employment to consider the suggestion seriously. Now, freelance consulting seemed like exactly the kind of work that would be difficult for the Mitchell family to sabotage. I called Dr. Martinez and asked if the offer was still open. "Absolutely," she said. "I know several small business owners who could use help with financial analysis, market research, business planning. The pay isn't steady, but it's good when the work is available, and you'd be working directly with business owners who make their own hiring decisions." Within a week, I had my first client. Marcus Chen owned 3 small restaurants in Portland's Hawthorne district and was considering expanding to a 4th location. He needed someone to analyze the market potential, review lease agreements, and develop financial projections for the new venture. "Dr. Martinez says you're brilliant with numbers and have great business instincts," Marcus told me during our initial meeting. "She also says you're going through a tough time and could use a break. I believe in helping people who are working hard to build something better." Marcus paid me more for 2 weeks of work than I'd made in a month at my previous jobs. More importantly, he treated me like a professional partner rather than a charity case. He listened to my analysis, asked thoughtful questions, and ultimately decided to move forward with the expansion based largely on my recommendations. "You have a gift for seeing patterns that other people miss," he told me when the project was finished. "If you ever decide to start your own consulting business, I'd be your first client." The idea hadn't occurred to me before, but once Marcus planted the seed, it grew quickly. I could start my own consulting practice, working with small and medium-sized businesses that needed strategic help but couldn't afford the big firms. It would allow me to use my education and skills while building something that belonged entirely to me. I spent the next month developing a business plan for Collins Strategic Consulting. I researched the market, identified potential clients, and calculated how much capital I'd need to get started. The numbers were daunting, but not impossible. I'd need basic office equipment, professional insurance, marketing materials, and enough savings to survive the initial months while building a client base. The equipment and insurance I could finance, the marketing materials I could create myself. The survival money was the real challenge. I had enough savings left for maybe 2 months of basic expenses, which wasn't nearly enough runway for a new business. That's when I decided to do something I'd never done before. I called my parents and asked for help. "Dad, I need to borrow some money to start a business," I said during our weekly phone call. "It's not a huge amount, but it's more than I can manage on my own right now." There was a pause on the other end of the line. My parents had never been in a position to loan anyone money, even their own children. They lived paycheck to paycheck, just like most working-class families. "How much are you talking about, sweetheart?" my father asked. $5,000, I said. "I know it's a lot, but I have a solid business plan, and I already have potential clients lined up." Another pause, then quiet conversation between my parents that I couldn't quite hear. "Emma," my mother came on the line, "your father and I have been talking about this for a while. We've been putting aside a little money each month for you and Danny, thinking maybe someday you'd want to buy a house or start a family. We don't have much, but we have about $6,000 saved. If you think starting this business is the right move, we want to help you do it." I started crying right there on the phone. Not just because of the money, although that was a lifeline I desperately needed, but because my parents believed in me enough to risk their own financial security on my dreams. After months of being told I wasn't good enough, smart enough, or worthy enough, my family was proving that I was worth investing in. "I promise I'll pay you back," I said through tears. "We know you will," my father said. "But more than that, we know you're going to build something amazing. We've always been proud of you, Emma, and we can't wait to see what you accomplish next." Collins Strategic Consulting officially opened for business on a rainy Monday morning in February. I'd rented a tiny office space in a converted warehouse in southeast Portland, furnished it with secondhand furniture and a reliable computer, and printed business cards that looked more professional than I felt. My first real challenge came from an unexpected source. A week after opening, I received a call from a potential client who'd heard about my services through Dr. Martinez's network. "I'm interested in hiring you for a project," the caller said, "but I need to ask you about some concerns that have been raised about your professional background." My heart sank. Even here, working independently with my own business, the Mitchell family's influence was reaching me. "What kind of concerns?" I asked. "Well, I received a call from someone claiming to be a former client of yours. They said you'd overcharged for services, missed deadlines, and provided substandard work. They suggested I might want to reconsider hiring you." I felt the familiar rage building, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Sir, I can provide you with references from every project I've worked on, including detailed testimonials from satisfied clients. I can also show you my academic records, my business license, and my professional insurance certificates. But I need to tell you something important." I took a deep breath and made a decision that would define how I handled these attacks going forward. "I'm being targeted by a harassment campaign," I said. "A wealthy family is trying to destroy my reputation because they disapprove of a personal relationship I had with their son. They've been making anonymous accusations against me for months, all of which have been investigated and found to be baseless. If you'd like to verify this, I can connect you with my attorney and the university officials who cleared me of similar false charges." There was a long pause. Then the potential client said something that surprised me. "You know what? I respect your honesty. Anyone being attacked this systematically must be doing something right. When can you start?" That conversation taught me an important lesson. Instead of hiding from the Mitchell family's attacks, I needed to address them head-on. Transparency and honesty were more powerful than denial or defensiveness. I developed a standard response for dealing with the anonymous complaints. I created a document that included my credentials, testimonials from real clients, documentation of the false academic charges that had been dismissed, and a clear explanation of the harassment campaign I was facing. Whenever a potential client raised concerns, I sent them this package and offered to connect them with my attorney for verification. The strategy worked. Most people, especially small business owners who understood what it meant to work hard for success, were outraged on my behalf. Several potential clients became actual clients, specifically because they wanted to support someone who is being unfairly targeted by wealthy bullies. Over the following months, Collins Strategic Consulting began to grow. I worked with restaurant owners, retail shops, small manufacturers, and service businesses. Each project taught me something new about different industries and business models. More importantly, each successful project built my reputation and my confidence. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was building something meaningful. The real breakthrough came in early summer, when Marcus Chen recommended me to a potential client who would change everything. Elena Rodriguez owned a small chain of eco-friendly cleaning supply stores that was struggling to compete with larger retailers. She needed someone to help her develop a strategy for growth and differentiation. Marcus says you're the smartest business consultant he's ever worked with, Elena told me during our initial meeting. He also says you're honest, which is apparently rare in your industry. Elena's challenge was complex. Her products were higher quality and more environmentally responsible than the mass-market alternatives, but they were also more expensive. She was losing customers to big-box stores that could offer cheaper prices, and she was struggling to communicate her value proposition effectively. I spent 3 weeks analyzing Elena's business, studying her competition, and researching consumer trends in sustainable products. What I discovered was that Elena wasn't just selling cleaning supplies. She was selling a lifestyle choice, a way for consumers to align their purchasing decisions with their values. The strategy I developed focused on repositioning Elena's stores as community hubs for environmentally conscious consumers. Instead of competing on price, we would compete on expertise, service, and shared values. We created workshops on sustainable living, partnered with local environmental groups, and developed a loyalty program that rewarded customers for making eco-friendly choices. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Within 6 months, Elena's sales had increased by 40%, and she was planning to open 2 additional locations. More importantly, she'd transformed her business from a struggling retailer into a thriving community resource. "Emma, you didn't just save my business," Elena told me. "You helped me understand what my business was really about. I want to offer you something." Elena's offer was unexpected and generous. She wanted me to become a part-time partner in her expansion, handling all strategic planning and business development in exchange for an equity stake in the new locations. "I've never had a business partner before," I admitted. "Neither have I," Elena said. "But I've learned that success is easier when you're working with people who understand your vision and share your values." The partnership with Elena marked a turning point in my life. I wasn't just running a consulting business anymore. I was building an investment portfolio, developing expertise in retail strategy, and creating wealth rather than just earning income. 6 months later, I was analyzing financial statements for one of Elena's new locations when I realized something that took my breath away. The equity value of my partnership, combined with the growth of my consulting practice, meant that I was worth more money than I'd ever imagined possible. Not rich by Mitchell family standards, but financially independent by any reasonable measure. I was sitting in my expanded office space, looking out at the Portland skyline, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Dr. Martinez's number. "Emma, I have some interesting news," she said. "I just heard from a colleague at the business school that Mitchell Industries is facing some serious financial difficulties. Apparently they lost several major contracts recently, and there are rumors about management problems and family conflicts affecting operations." I felt a strange sense of detachment from this information. There was a time when news about the Mitchell family would have consumed my thoughts, but now it felt like hearing about strangers. "That's unfortunate," I said, and I meant it. I didn't wish suffering on anyone, even people who'd tried to destroy my life. "There's more," Dr. Martinez continued. "I also heard that Ryan Mitchell is back in Portland. Apparently his job in New York didn't work out as planned, and he's been trying to find work locally." That information did affect me, though not in the way I had expected. Instead of heartbreak or anger, I felt a kind of sad closure. Ryan had given up everything we'd built together to chase his family's version of success, and it hadn't worked out for him. I hoped he'd learned something from the experience, but it was no longer my concern. I appreciate you letting me know, I told Dr. Martinez. But honestly, that feels like someone else's life now. And it did. The girl who'd been devastated by Ryan's abandonment, who'd felt worthless when his family rejected her, who'd believed that love was worth any sacrifice, was gone. In her place was a woman who'd built something substantial with her own hands, who'd learned that the most important relationship was the one she had with herself. That evening, I called my parents to give them an update on the business. "Dad, I want you to know that I'll be able to pay back your loan next month," I said, with interest. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," he said. "But we're not worried about the money. We're just proud of what you've accomplished." "Actually, there's something else," I said. "I want to set up a college fund for Danny, and I want to help you and Mom pay off the mortgage. The business is doing well enough that I can afford to take care of my family." There was silence on the other end of the line, then the sound of my mother crying. "Emma," she said when she could speak again, "we are so proud of you, not because of the money, but because of who you've become. You faced something terrible, and you didn't let it break you. You built something beautiful instead." Later that night, I stood on the balcony of my new apartment, looking out over the city where I'd once felt so lost and defeated. Portland looked different now. Not like a place where I'd been rejected and humiliated, but like a place where I'd discovered my own strength and created my own success. I thought about Patricia Mitchell and her offer of $50,000 to disappear from her son's life. The irony was almost funny. She'd been so concerned about a working-class girl trying to access her family's wealth that she'd never considered the possibility that I might create wealth of my own. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was the knowledge that I'd faced the worst that wealthy, powerful people could do to someone like me, and I'd not only survived but thrived. I'd learned that my worth had nothing to do with other people's approval, and everything to do with my own values and actions. I was no longer the girl who'd spilled coffee on a boy outside a library. I was Emma Collins, business owner, strategic consultant, and investor. I was someone who'd been tested by fire and emerged stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. And I was just getting started. 3 years had passed since I'd started Collins Strategic Consulting, and my life bore no resemblance to the desperate situation I'd found myself in when the Mitchell family had tried to erase me from existence. I was sitting in the conference room of my expanded offices, reviewing quarterly reports with my team of 4 consultants, when my assistant knocked on the door. "Emma, there's someone here to see you," Jessica said, looking slightly confused. "She says she's Ryan Mitchell's mother and that it's urgent." The name hit me like an echo from another lifetime. Patricia Mitchell, the woman who'd offered me money to disappear, who'd orchestrated a campaign to destroy my reputation, who'd been so certain that I was nothing more than an opportunistic girl trying to access her family's wealth. "Tell her I'm in meetings all afternoon," I said without hesitation. "Actually," Jessica continued, "she says she'll wait as long as necessary. She's been sitting in the lobby for over an hour." I glanced around the conference table at my team. Elena Rodriguez had become not just a business partner, but one of my closest friends. Her eco-friendly cleaning supply chain now had 12 locations across Oregon and Washington, and we were planning expansion into California. Marcus Chen now owned 7 restaurants and credited our strategic partnership with his expansion success. 2 other consultants I'd hired were brilliant recent graduates who reminded me of myself at their age, hungry and determined to prove their worth. These people represented the life I'd built from nothing. They respected my expertise, valued my judgment, and had helped create something meaningful together. This was my world now, and Patricia Mitchell had no place in it. "Give me 10 minutes to wrap up here," I told Jessica, "then show her to my office." Elena caught my eye across the table. "Everything all right?" "Just ghosts from the past," I said. "Nothing I can't handle." The quarterly reports we'd been reviewing told the story of unprecedented growth. Collins Strategic Consulting had generated over $2 million in revenue the previous year, with profit margins that would make any business owner envious. My personal investment portfolio, built through equity stakes in client companies and smart real estate investments, was worth more than I'd ever dreamed possible. I owned a beautiful townhouse in Portland's Pearl District, drove a car I'd paid for in cash, and had enough savings to weather any economic storm. But the numbers on paper told only part of the story. The real measure of my success was the impact we'd had on other businesses. 37 companies had used our services to navigate growth challenges, restructure operations, or develop strategic plans for expansion. Hundreds of jobs had been created or saved through our recommendations. Small business owners who'd once struggled to compete with larger corporations now commanded market share in their industries. When Patricia Mitchell entered my office 15 minutes later, I almost didn't recognize her. The perfectly composed woman who'd once looked at me like I was something unpleasant she'd found on her shoe appeared diminished somehow. Her designer clothes were still expensive, but they seemed to hang differently on her frame. Her hair was still professionally styled, but there were new lines around her eyes that makeup couldn't quite conceal. She looked around my office with an expression I couldn't quite read. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Portland, offering a panoramic view of the city where I'd once felt so powerless. Original artwork hung on the walls, pieces I'd purchased from local artists as my business grew, each one representing not just aesthetic preference, but investment in the creative community. My desk was solid walnut, purchased to replace the card table I'd started with, custom-made by a furniture craftsman whose workshop I'd helped save from bankruptcy. Awards and recognition from the Portland Business Journal, Oregon Small Business Association, and Chamber of Commerce were displayed prominently, testament to the respect I'd earned in the business community. The office itself occupied the entire top floor of a renovated historic building in the heart of Portland's business district. When I'd first toured the space 2 years earlier, the rent had seemed impossibly expensive. Now it felt like exactly where I belonged, surrounded by the trappings of success I'd earned through intelligence, determination, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. "Emma," she said, and I noticed her voice lacked the commanding tone I remembered. "Thank you for seeing me." "Mrs. Mitchell," I replied, remaining standing behind my desk. "What can I do for you?" She seemed to expect an invitation to sit, but I didn't offer one. After a moment, she settled into one of the chairs facing my desk without being asked. Even this small gesture revealed how much the power dynamic between us had shifted. The woman who'd once summoned me to coffee shops to deliver ultimatums was now asking permission to sit in my office. "I suppose you've heard about our family's recent difficulties," she began. I had heard, of course. Portland's business community wasn't large enough for major corporate troubles to remain secret for long. Mitchell Industries had lost 3 major manufacturing contracts in the past year, including a lucrative government defense contract that had been the backbone of their operations for over a decade. There were rumors of management disputes, family conflicts affecting business decisions, and serious cash flow problems. The local business press had been covering the story with the kind of detailed attention usually reserved for major scandals. More than that, I'd heard the specifics from contacts throughout the industry. Bob Mitchell had made a series of poor strategic decisions, expanding into markets he didn't understand while neglecting the core manufacturing business that had built the family fortune. He'd invested heavily in technology upgrades that had failed to materialize promised efficiency gains. Most damaging of all, he'd alienated key clients through arrogance and inflexibility, assuming that the Mitchell name alone would guarantee continued business relationships. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same family pride and sense of superiority that had led Patricia to reject me as unsuitable for her son had also blinded them to the changing realities of their industry. They'd been so convinced of their inherent superiority that they'd failed to adapt to new competition, changing client expectations, and evolving market conditions. "I'm sorry to hear you're facing challenges," I said neutrally. Patricia looked surprised by my response, as if she'd expected something different, gloating perhaps, or sarcasm. "The truth is," she continued, "we need help. Strategic advice about restructuring, cost reduction, possibly even finding new investment partners. Your reputation in the consulting community is quite impressive." I felt a laugh building in my chest, but I suppressed it. The irony was too perfect. The woman who'd once told me I was unsuitable for her family was now asking for my professional help to save that same family's business. "I'm flattered," I said carefully, "but Collins Strategic Consulting focuses primarily on small and medium-sized businesses. We don't typically work with large manufacturing companies." "Please," Patricia said, and there was something in her voice I'd never heard before. Desperation. I know we didn't part on good terms. I know I said things, did things that were unfair to you. But this isn't about the past. This is about saving hundreds of jobs. Preserving a company that's been in our family for 3 generations. I studied her face, trying to understand what was really happening here. Patricia Mitchell didn't strike me as someone who would easily admit to being wrong or ask for help from someone she'd once considered beneath her notice. The fact that she was here, in my office, essentially begging for assistance, suggested that Mitchell Industries' problems were far more serious than the public reports indicated. "What happened to your regular consulting firm?" I asked. "Surely Mitchell Industries has worked with established advisors before." Patricia's composure cracked slightly. "We've been through several firms in the past 2 years. The problems are more complex than anyone anticipated, and frankly, we can't afford the fees that the large firms charge anymore." The admission hung in the air between us. Patricia Mitchell was essentially telling me that her family's financial situation was so dire that they couldn't afford premium consulting services. They needed someone skilled enough to solve complex problems but desperate enough to work for whatever they could afford to pay. But I wasn't desperate anymore. I was successful enough to be selective about my clients, wealthy enough to turn down lucrative contracts that didn't align with my values, and secure enough to prioritize principle over profit. "I see," I said. "And you thought of me because you assume I'd be grateful for the opportunity to work with your family despite our history?" "No," Patricia said quickly. "I thought of you because everyone I've spoken with says you're the most innovative strategic consultant in Portland. Marcus Chen credits you with transforming his entire business model. Elena Rodriguez calls you a genius. Dr. Martinez from the university says you have the best analytical mind she's encountered in 20 years of teaching." Hearing these testimonials from Patricia Mitchell was surreal. She was quoting the very people who'd supported me when she'd been trying to destroy my life. She'd spent months trying to convince Portland's business community that I was unreliable and dishonest, and now she was citing their respect for my work as the reason she needed my help. "Mrs. Mitchell," I said, "I appreciate that you're facing a difficult situation. But I think you may have forgotten something important about our previous interactions." Patricia winced as if she'd been expecting this moment. "You didn't just disapprove of my relationship with your son," I continued. "You actively tried to destroy my life. You sabotaged my employment, filed false academic charges against me, and did everything in your power to drive me out of Portland entirely. You offered me money to disappear because you were convinced I was only interested in your family's wealth." "I was wrong," she said quietly. "I was completely wrong about you, about your motivations, about everything." The admission was startling, but I wasn't finished. "You were wrong about more than my motivations," I said. "You were wrong about my capabilities, my worth, and my right to exist in this city without being harassed by people who thought their money made them more important than everyone else." Patricia nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. I know how badly I behaved, how unfair I was to you. If I could take it back, if I could undo the damage I caused, I would. But you can't," I said simply. "And now you want me to help save the business empire that you thought made your family superior to people like me." "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I have no right to ask. I know you have every reason to refuse. But Emma, I'm not just asking for myself. There are employees who've worked for Mitchell Industries their entire careers. Families who depend on those jobs. Communities that would be devastated if we have to close our doors." It was a compelling argument, and I could see the calculation behind it. Patricia knew I wouldn't help her family out of forgiveness or financial incentive, but she thought I might be motivated by concern for innocent people who would suffer if the company failed. She wasn't entirely wrong. The thought of hundreds of people losing their jobs because of management failures and family conflicts was genuinely troubling. But Patricia had made one crucial miscalculation in her approach. "Mrs. Mitchell," I said, "do you remember what you told me when you offered me $50,000 to leave your son alone?" She closed her eyes, as if the memory was painful. "You said I should find someone from my own social level and build a nice, simple life," I continued. "You said I had nothing to offer Ryan except youth and physical attraction. You said I would never understand the responsibilities that come with wealth." "I remember," she said quietly. Well, here's what you didn't understand then and apparently still don't understand now, I said, my voice gaining strength. I did build something. Not a nice, simple life, but something extraordinary. I built a business that's helped dozens of companies succeed, created jobs for talented people, and generated more wealth than I ever dreamed possible when I was that scared college student you tried to destroy. Patricia looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. The responsibilities that come with wealth, I continued. I understand them perfectly. I understand the obligation to treat people with dignity, regardless of their background. I understand the responsibility to use success to lift others up rather than tear them down. I understand that money doesn't make you better than anyone else. It just makes you more responsible for how you use your advantages. I walked around my desk to stand directly in front of her chair, and for the first time in our relationship, I was literally and figuratively looking down at Patricia Mitchell. So here's my answer to your request for help, I said. Collins Strategic Consulting doesn't work with companies whose leadership has demonstrated a pattern of abusing their power to harm innocent people. We don't work with clients we can't respect. And we don't work with people who would destroy others simply because they felt threatened by their existence. Patricia's face crumpled. But I wasn't finished. However, I continued, I know several excellent consulting firms that specialize in corporate restructuring and crisis management. I'd be happy to provide you with references. I can also connect you with financial advisors who work with companies facing liquidity challenges. The offer of professional referrals seemed to surprise her. You would do that? She asked. After everything? I would do that because those Mitchell Industries employees you mentioned deserve competent help, even if their employers don't deserve my forgiveness, I said. And because I'm successful enough now to be generous with people who once tried to destroy me. Patricia stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her processing the full implications of our conversation. She'd come here expecting to find the same young woman she'd once intimidated and manipulated. Instead, she'd encountered someone who had not only survived her attacks, but transformed them into fuel for unprecedented success. I returned to my chair and pulled out a business card from one of the consulting firms I'd mentioned. As I wrote a brief note of introduction on the back, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The girl who'd once been devastated by Patricia's rejection would never have imagined that someday she'd be in a position to offer professional assistance to the very family that had tried to destroy her. This is David Chen's firm, I said, handing her the card. He specializes in manufacturing restructuring and has successfully turned around several companies in situations similar to yours. Tell him I referred you, and he'll prioritize your case. Patricia took the card with trembling hands, staring at it like it was a lifeline. Emma, she said, looking up at me with something that might have been wonder. How did you do it? How did you build all this after what we put you through? It was a fair question, and one I'd asked myself many times during the darkest periods of my reconstruction. I had advantages that you never recognized, I said. Intelligence, determination, and the ability to learn from failure. But most importantly, I had something your family never understood. I had nothing left to lose. Patricia frowned, clearly not understanding. When you destroyed my employment, my academic standing, and my relationship with your son, you thought you were taking away everything that mattered to me, I explained. But what you actually did was strip away all the external validations I'd been depending on. You forced me to discover what I was actually worth when nobody else believed in me. I gestured around the office, encompassing not just the physical space but everything it represented. This didn't happen in spite of what your family did to me, I said. It happened because of what your family did to me. You pushed me to a place where I had to become stronger, smarter, and more resourceful than I'd ever been before. You gave me the greatest gift anyone could give an ambitious person, the absolute necessity of succeeding entirely on my own merits. Patricia was crying openly now, but I wasn't sure whether the tears were from regret, admiration, or simple recognition of how completely she'd misjudged the situation. I need to ask you something, she said finally. Ryan, do you ever think about him? The question caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because of how little it affected me. Occasionally, I said honestly. I hope he's learned something from his experiences. I hope he's found a way to be happy that doesn't require diminishing other people. He asks about you sometimes, Patricia said. He regrets how things ended between you. That's unfortunate, I said, and I meant it. But regret doesn't undo choices, and it doesn't change consequences. Ryan had the opportunity to stand up for what we built together, and he chose not to. That's not my responsibility to forgive or forget. Patricia nodded slowly. He's back in Portland, you know. The job in New York didn't work out. Neither did his relationship with Victoria Ashworth. I felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy, but it passed quickly. I'm sorry to hear that, I said. But Ryan's career difficulties and relationship problems aren't my concern anymore. He made his choices based on what he thought would make him happy. I made mine based on what I knew would make me strong. There was a knock on my door, and Jessica appeared with a stack of documents requiring my signature. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, but the contracts for the Seattle expansion need to be reviewed before the 5 o'clock deadline. Of course, I said, gesturing for her to place them on my desk. Mrs. Mitchell was just leaving. Patricia stood up from the chair, gathering her purse and what remained of her dignity. As she moved toward the door, she paused and turned back to face me. Emma, she said, I want you to know that I understand now what I failed to see before. You were never trying to take anything from our family. You were trying to build something with my son. I destroyed that because I was afraid, because I couldn't imagine that someone from your background could be anything other than a threat to our security. You were right about one thing, I said. I was a threat to your security, just not in the way you thought. Patricia looked puzzled. You were threatened by the possibility that your son might choose love over status, authenticity over appearance, partnership over privilege. I explained. You were threatened by the idea that he might build something real with someone real, instead of playing the role you'd assigned to him in your family's social theater. And you were right to be threatened, I continued. Because if Ryan had chosen me, if he'd been strong enough to build the life we planned together, he might have become someone you couldn't control. Someone who valued character over connections, who measured success by personal fulfillment rather than social approval. Patricia's eyes filled with tears again. I robbed him of that possibility, didn't I? You offered him a choice, I said. He made it freely, based on his own values and priorities. The fact that he chose your approval over our partnership tells you everything you need to know about his character. Patricia moved toward the door, then turned back one final time. For what it's worth, she said, I think he chose wrong. So do I said. But not because he lost me. Because he lost the chance to discover who he could have become if he'd been brave enough to choose his own path. After Patricia left, I stood by my office window, looking out at the city where I'd once felt so small and powerless. My phone buzzed with a text from Elena asking if everything was all right. Another message from Marcus inviting me to dinner with his family. A notification about a new client inquiry that had come through our website. This was my life now. Built not on someone else's approval or financial support, but on my own skills, determination, and willingness to help others succeed. I had a business that mattered, relationships based on mutual respect, and financial independence that no one could threaten or take away. 2 weeks later, I was having lunch at one of Marcus's restaurants when I saw a familiar figure sitting alone at a corner table. Ryan Mitchell looked older than his years, wearing a rumpled business suit that had seen better days. He was staring at his phone with the kind of desperate concentration that suggested he was waiting for a call that wasn't coming. Our eyes met across the restaurant, and I saw recognition flicker across his face, followed immediately by something that looked like shame. He half rose from his chair as if he might approach my table, but I simply nodded politely and returned to my conversation with Elena. We were discussing the California expansion plans, and I had no interest in interrupting important business for uncomfortable personal encounters. But Ryan apparently had other ideas. He appeared beside our table a few minutes later, holding his coffee cup like a shield. Emma, he said quietly, I wondered if I might have a word with you. Elena glanced between us with obvious curiosity. I'd told her about my history with the Mitchell family, but she'd never seen any of the players in person. This is Elena Rodriguez, I said, making no move to invite Ryan to sit. Elena, this is Ryan Mitchell. Elena's expression immediately became cooler, and I appreciated her loyalty. I'll give you some privacy, she said, starting to stand. That's not necessary, I said. I'm sure Mr. Mitchell can say whatever he needs to say quickly. Ryan looked uncomfortable but determined. I heard my mother came to see you, he said. I wanted to apologize for that. She had no right to ask you for help after everything our family put you through. Your mother was trying to save her family's business, I said neutrally. I can't fault her for that, even if I declined to assist. Emma, I need you to know that I never wanted any of what happened to you, Ryan continued. The job sabotage, the academic charges, all of it. I had no idea my parents were doing those things until it was too late to stop them. I studied his face, trying to determine whether he was telling the truth. Even if he was, it didn't change the fundamental reality of his choices. I believe you, I said. But ignorance isn't the same as innocence, Ryan. You knew your parents disapproved of me, and you knew they had the resources to make our lives difficult. When things got challenging, you chose the path of least resistance rather than fighting for what we supposedly meant to each other. Ryan winced as if I'd slapped him. I was young and stupid. I thought if I established myself professionally, if I proved I could succeed on my own terms, I could come back and we could try again. And how did that work out for you? Elena asked, her voice dripping with disdain. Ryan's face flushed red, but he pressed on. It didn't work out at all. The job in New York was a trap. Victoria's family used me to get information about Mitchell Industries' client relationships, then dropped me when they'd gotten what they needed. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late to salvage anything. The admission was startling. I'd known that Ryan's New York adventure had ended badly, but I hadn't realized he'd been actively betrayed by the very people his parents had preferred over me. I'm sorry that happened to you, I said, and I genuinely was. Being used and discarded was a painful experience, regardless of who it happened to. Emma, I know I have no right to ask this, Ryan said, his voice breaking slightly, but I wondered if there might be a chance for us to try again. I've learned so much about what really matters, about the difference between genuine love and social convenience. I know now that what we had was real in a way that nothing else has been. The request hung in the air between us, and I felt Elena tense beside me. This was the moment I'd fantasized about during the darkest days of my recovery. Ryan Mitchell coming back, admitting he'd been wrong, begging for another chance. But now that it was actually happening, I felt nothing except a kind of mild curiosity about my own reaction. Ryan, I said gently, I appreciate your honesty, and I'm glad you've learned something from your experiences. But the woman you fell in love with doesn't exist anymore. He looked confused. What do you mean? I mean that Emma Collins, the community college student who was so desperate for your family's approval that she was willing to sacrifice her own dignity for it, is gone, I explained. The woman sitting here today was forged in the fire of everything your family put me through. She's stronger, more successful, and more self-aware than the girl you once knew. I gestured around the restaurant, which was bustling with the kind of energy that comes from a thriving business. This is Marcus's flagship location, I said. He owns 6 more restaurants now, all of them successful, all of them providing good jobs for dozens of families. That happened because I helped him develop a strategic plan that aligned with his values and his community's needs. I turned to Elena. Elena's company has grown from 3 stores to 12 in 2 years. She's employing over 100 people and has transformed how her industry thinks about environmental responsibility. That happened because we worked together to build something meaningful. Ryan was listening intently, and I could see him beginning to understand the magnitude of what he'd missed. The life I've built doesn't have room for someone who would abandon me when things get difficult, I continued. It doesn't have room for someone who would choose his family's approval over our partnership. And it certainly doesn't have room for someone who would let other people destroy the woman he claimed to love, without fighting back. But I want to fight now, Ryan said desperately. I want to make up for lost time, to prove that I've changed. It's too late for that, I said simply. Not because I'm angry or holding a grudge, but because I've moved beyond the place where your validation matters to me. I don't need you to fight for me now, Ryan. I learned to fight for myself, Elena squeezed my hand under the table, a gesture of support and solidarity. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I told Ryan. "I hope you learn to build something meaningful with someone who doesn't have to wonder whether you'll stand by them when things get challenging." But that someone isn't me. Ryan stood there for another moment, clearly hoping I might say something that would give him reason to believe another conversation might be possible. When I simply smiled politely and returned to my conversation with Elena, he finally walked away. "Wow," Elena said after he was gone. "That was more restrained than I would have been." "Anger is a luxury I can't afford," I said. "It takes too much energy away from building the things that actually matter." That evening I was working late in my office when Jessica knocked on the door. "Emma, there's a call for you," she said. "Someone from the Portland Business Journal. They want to interview you about being named Consultant of the Year." The award was a significant honor, recognition from my peers, that Collins Strategic Consulting had become a major force in Portland's business community. But more than the personal recognition, it represented validation of the approach I'd taken to rebuilding my life. Success built on merit, relationships based on mutual respect, and growth that lifted others up, rather than tearing them down. "Tell them I'll be happy to do the interview," I said. "But I want to make sure they understand that this isn't just about individual achievement. This is about what's possible when people support each other, instead of tearing each other down." After Jessica left, I stayed in my office for another hour, not working but simply thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. The awards on my walls, the financial statements showing consistent growth, the testimonials from satisfied clients, all of it represented more than business success. It represented the triumph of character over circumstance, of determination over despair. I thought about the young woman I'd been when I first met Ryan Mitchell outside that library. She'd been so eager to please, so desperate for acceptance, so convinced that her worth was determined by other people's opinions of her. That woman had believed that love required sacrifice, that relationships were about finding someone to complete you rather than someone to build with. The woman I'd become understood that the most important relationship was the one you had with yourself. That success meant creating value in the world, not extracting it from others. That wealth was about freedom and security and the ability to be generous, not about status or power over other people. Patricia Mitchell had spent months trying to convince me that I wasn't good enough for her son. What she'd actually done was force me to discover that I was good enough for myself. In trying to destroy me, she'd pushed me to become stronger, more capable, and more successful than I'd ever imagined possible. The irony was perfect. In her desperate attempt to protect her family's wealth from a supposed gold digger, Patricia had created exactly the kind of person she'd claimed I was trying to become. Someone with money, influence, and the power to help or harm others based on their choices. The difference was that I'd earned everything I had, and I used it to build others up, rather than tear them down. My phone buzzed with a text from my parents, who'd driven up from Cedar Valley for dinner the night before. They'd toured my office, met my team, and marveled at the transformation in their daughter's life. But what had pleased them most wasn't the material success. It was seeing that I'd remained kind, generous, and grounded despite everything I'd achieved. "We're so proud of the woman you've become," the text read. "Not because of what you've accomplished, but because of how you've accomplished it. Love, Mom and Dad." I smiled and put the phone away. The approval that mattered most had always been available to me. I'd just been too focused on seeking validation from people who would never give it, to recognize the love and support that had been there all along. The Portland skyline glittered outside my windows, and I could see the lights of the neighborhoods where I'd once struggled to find work, where I'd been rejected and dismissed, where I'd been told I didn't belong. Now those same streets were home to clients who sought my advice, colleagues who respected my expertise, and friends who valued my partnership. This was my city now, not because I'd conquered it, but because I'd earned my place in it. Through intelligence, determination, and an unwavering commitment to treating others with the dignity I'd once been denied. The Mitchell family would survive their current crisis, or they wouldn't. Ryan would learn from his mistakes, or he wouldn't. Patricia would gain wisdom from her defeat, or she wouldn't. None of that was my responsibility anymore. I had a business to run, clients to serve, and a future to build. The past was finally, truly behind me. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.